Before we begin, a quick note of caution that some of what you're about to hear is graphic and potentially triggering of what was a traumatic event. From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. April 23rd, 2018. A day of unimaginable tragedy in Toronto. During the lunch hour on Yonge Street, the city's biggest and busiest, a 25-year-old man barreled southbound in a full-size van. He hopped the curb and started hitting pedestrians. Many of them never saw it coming. The driver of the van, Alek Minassian, would continue speeding down Yonge Street, hitting more people, the attack lasting 26 minutes. Confusion turned into chaos. Witnesses ran toward bleeding strangers to help in any way they could.
Get down! No, get down! Get down!
Finally, Minassian was stopped by a single police officer 2 kilometers south of where the attack started. In a standoff, he told the officer he had a gun and to shoot him. Instead, the officer arrested Minassian unharmed, putting an end to the attack. The Toronto van attack is the worst mass killing the city has ever seen. 10 people dead, another 16 seriously injured, thousands of others. Family, friends, witnesses to the attack had their lives upended. Toronto was in shock, disbelief, and we fell into deep mourning. Now, nearly 3 years later, Minassian is about to head to trial on Tuesday, November 10th. He's admitted to planning and carrying out the attack. The Crown believes Minassian acted alone. So why is this case going to trial? To help explain, we're talking to Alyshah Hasham, the Toronto Star's courts and justice reporter. Alyshah has been covering every step of the legal process so far. We'll explain what this trial will actually focus on, how this high-profile case will be handled in a pandemic, and what we might learn from this horrific moment. Alyshah, it's good to talk to you.
I'm happy to be here.
So you report on a lot of difficult and tragic court cases, but I think few cases in Toronto's history carry this much weight, this much collective trauma. I think of every reporter, every person who lives in the city remembers where they were when it happened. How do you think the weight of all of that plays into this trial? Does it at all?
I think that's such a huge and important part of this case. This is an extraordinary number of just victims linked to the criminal charges alone. 10 people were killed, 16 people were seriously injured. And those are just the criminal charges. That doesn't include the number of people who were there that day, who hold that trauma, the people who did CPR, the people who were worried for their loved ones or were caught up in the chaos of that day and the subsequent days. It deeply traumatized the whole city, and especially that sort of area of North York, which is a really high density area. People live there, they work there, they go by there every day. It's such a big part of this case. And because of COVID and the sort of new way that we're doing this trial, there is a certain sense of loss that there won't be a kind of communal setting in which the trial will happen because people won't be able to physically be in the courtroom. In normal circumstances, the trial would have been in sort of a really large courtroom in downtown Toronto, where sort of the victims and their families would have been able to be present and people who were affected would have been able to be present and be together. And that won't happen now.
Yeah, I remember in the days afterwards that obviously vigils popped up, that there was a collective mourning that was happening in the city that now sort of on the legal side, that can't happen.
Absolutely. So because of restrictions on the number of people that can be in court now, due to not only Toronto being in sort of modified stage 2, but just generally limits on gathering places, the trial is going to be held entirely on Zoom, which means that not only are there not going to be actually anybody in court, if this is the current plan, it's going to be everyone, the judge, the lawyers, Minassian himself will be videoed in from the jail where he's at, witnesses, everyone is going to be participating via Zoom. And there will be ways for the media and the public to watch effectively sort of what looks like, I think people are familiar now with what a Zoom conference kind of looks like, and there'll be that. And what's sort of a little unclear is what kind of public spaces will be available to watch these, just because, we can't gather indoors for long periods of time. And, courts require, it sort of takes between 10 to 4:30, several hours of a day. And so people may be watching from home. People may be watching potentially from some kind of viewing area, but it'll be separate.
So all the players then, to be clear, in this trial will be in separate places. It will happen virtually. Entirely
virtually, exactly. And so no one's going to be in the same room as each other. Potentially, maybe the Crowns and perhaps the defense lawyers will be in the same room as the two defense lawyers may be in the same room together and the Crowns may be in the same room together. But yeah, everyone will be calling in remotely.
Are there any concerns from the courts over how reliable this might be, especially considering how big this trial is?
So over the last couple of months, the adoption of Zoom trials is an entirely new and completely unforeseeable turn of events. While there has been some adoption of video conferencing technology, no one ever thought that this would happen. There's a couple of things in that there's been a number of Zoom trials now, so people are sort of able to learn from those experiences. The judge in this case, Justice Malloy, is a very experienced judge, and the registrar in this case, who's sort of someone who does the logistics, have both recently done a Zoom trial where they were able to kind of see how it worked and work at some of the challenges around, for example, muting people or having people unmuted, around how to share documents, around how to just manage a lot of the kind of simple logistical type things. How does someone make an objection? How do you have a conversation when a witness needs to be excluded, which often happens? The other kind of key thing about this case is it's not a jury trial, so element doesn't have to come into play. So I don't think there's been really much consideration of doing jury trials by Zoom in Ontario. Those would happen in person. And in fact, those have been suspended because of the gathering limits at the moment. So they're going to do a test run of the case, sort of just to work at some of the tech issues on Monday, which would have been the first day of trial. So the trial is going to start on Tuesday now. There has been, for sure, a learning curve, but a lot of the kinds of fears that people had initially about not being able to make objections or not being able to hear or see people or sort of gauge facial expressions or demeanor, some of those concerns have been limited. And sort of the other thing about this particular case is there's not going to be civilian witnesses necessarily. So like normal kind of eyewitness. That day, a lot of that stuff has been resolved because Minassian has admitted that he was a person who drove the van. He was a person who killed these people, injured these people. So it's really going to be sort of a lot of expert evidence, which is a little different kind of trial where there would be a hostile cross-examination.
Right. That they're mainly leaning on the testimony of forensic psychiatrists that have spoken to Minassian. Is the pandemic, is that why this is a judge-only trial, that this isn't by jury? Is that what's happening here?
No. So this predates the pandemic. Last year, there had been some concern by the defense that Minassian wouldn't be able to receive a fair trial by jury. And just to explain, murder trials are automatically jury trials. And it requires special permission from the Attorney General to have a judge alone trial in a murder case. It's quite rare. It does happen in certain cases. And rather than, try and move the trial to a different jurisdiction, ultimately it was consented to by the Attorney General that this trial be judge alone. And so this is something that predates the pandemic.
So the thing that you just mentioned there about what's different in this trial is that it's not about whether or not Alek Minassian carried out this attack. As you just mentioned, he did it. He admitted in court that he did it, that he had planned it, that he had a motivation for it. So what exactly is the judge determining in this trial then?
Right. So this is a trial that is going to rest on whether Minassian was criminally responsible for killing these people. So the Crown's position is that Minassian committed first-degree murder, which means murder that was planned and deliberate, and he did it intentionally, meant to kill those people. And we've heard from Minassian's police interview, which is sort of another unusual element of this case, is that we have this 4-hour interview with Minassian done about 9 hours after the actual attack, in which he explains at length his involvement with the incel subculture, that he rented the van, sort of how he chose the date that he was going to commit this act on, that he planned it. So we have a lot of information that we normally don't have in any kind of criminal case. And that's going to be a focus point, I think. That video and a second video in which he calls himself a murderer, those are going to be key parts of examining whether he's criminally responsible, which is what the defense will be trying to say he isn't. And so that means the judge is going to have to consider a couple of things. One is that, does Minassian have what is known as a disease of the mind, which is a vague, all-encompassing term for some kind of mental disorder? That's sort of the first criteria that would have to be met. And we don't actually know what the defense is going to say constitutes that disease of the mind in Minassian's case. And once sort of that point is established, the question is whether that mental disorder made it impossible for him to understand the nature and quality of what he did, or whether the mental disorder made it impossible for him to understand that what he did was wrong. That means the judge is going to sort of have to consider questions like, did he make a rational choice? Was he capable of making a rational choice to commit these acts? Did he have the capacity to foresee the physical consequences of the acts? So did he know that by driving the van into somebody that they would die? So those are the kinds of questions that will be asked. And it's really going to come down to, I think, the testimony of, as you said, forensic psychiatrists, potentially psychologists, and potentially other experts who will have assessed Minassian or have assessed these interviews. And the Crown will have an expert and the defense will have an expert, and they'll have prepared detailed reports. There'll have been probably lots of kind of risk and psychological testing that will have been done. Minassian may have been interviewed. They may have talked to his family members. They may have talked to other people in his life. They will have reviewed his medical records. There was a motion last year, in which the defense was trying to access Minassian's laptops and cell phones in order to obtain information potentially for his defense. So there may have been a review of material from those devices that we don't really know. We don't really know what was in them. We do know they were ultimately able to access them, I believe. So all of that's going to come into consideration of whether Minassian was not criminally responsible or whether he committed a planned and deliberate murder.
We'll be right back. So this case hinges not so much whether on the idea of guilt, but what his state of mind was at the time of the attack. That's really what the trial focuses on, if I'm getting that right.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a question of, are you guilty of a criminal act, or are you incapable of committing a criminal act because of your mental disorder? And so there's two different paths that leads you down. Obviously, if you're found guilty of a criminal act, you can be sentenced and you would go to jail. Sort of everyone is presumed to be sort of automatically is presumed to not have a mental disorder, and you're presumed to be capable of being responsible. But the other track sort of is part of an understanding in our society that sometimes because of a mental disorder, you may be rendered incapable of either understanding the nature and quality of the acts or understanding something was wrong. And in those cases, you need treatment or therapy or, medication, or, it's not your fault that this happened. And so then the person would go, probably what often happens, to a forensic psychiatric hospital. And the thing that about being found not criminally responsible is that, unlike a jail sentence, which is in most cases a defined period of time, being found not criminally responsible can lead to an indefinite period of detention. So there's no set limit on how long you might be in that hospital. It depends on the disorder. It depends on treatment. It depends on a lot of different things. But there are people who have been found not criminally responsible of something really minor who have stayed for decades in forensic hospitals and haven't been allowed to leave, because the criteria to leave is whether you pose a significant risk to the safety of the public. So a lot of it comes down to thinking about public safety. It's not necessarily that someone sort of walks out free from court because they're found to be not criminally responsible. There is another sort of process that kicks in.
Alyshah, so much of the Minassian case is about the incel movement and terrorism. He says that he is an incel, that was the motivation for his attack. Obviously, talking about the incel movement and of that subculture, it was something that many people learned about in the days following the arrest. Will we learn any more about that in this trial?
Yeah. So Minassian in his police interview talks about wanting to spark an uprising, and he talks about a mission, and he talks about other sort of incel attacks or incel linked attacks. But he was never charged with a terrorism-related offense. He was only charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. And sort of similarly to the Alexander Bissonnette case, where he was also not charged with terrorism offenses, despite there sort of being this like clear link to this kind of political act wanting to spark or incite violence, having sort of ideological purpose or political intimidation, those kinds of elements. But because those charges weren't laid, we're probably not going to get into a real discussion of whether the incel group constitutes sort of a terror group, or if this is sort of meets the criteria under Canadian law for being this kind of ideological or having a sort of a coherent ideology. Those things haven't really been tested in Canadian courts yet. However, earlier this year, we did see a terror-related murder charge in an incel-linked case where I guess a youth who was 17 at the time was charged in addition to murder with a terror. And that was a first in Canada. It may have been a first in the world. And that case hasn't come to trial yet. So we don't know how that's going to play out, but it's likely not going to play out in Minassian's actual trial.
This is a very painful, a deeply personal trial. Of course, victims have lost their lives, and some people who were injured have had their lives changed forever. Thousands of witnesses, of course, that day on Yonge Street in 2018, they saw horrific things. Will victims have an opportunity to play a role in this trial via victim statements, or, again, you mentioned before, possibility of watching in a communal space? Is there any role that the victims themselves might have in this trial?
Typically, during the trial process, the answer is no. And in this particular trial, there isn't going to be any kind of eyewitness testimony because so much has been admitted to. So people aren't going to be called on to testify about what they saw that day, which is good in terms of not having people relive on the witness stand. Victims won't have the opportunity to be in court to sort of face Minassian, which is something that some people had wanted to do, to sort of confront him with what he did, the pain that he caused, to be able to look him in the eye. And they also won't be able to be together and have that shared sense of community and the kind of understanding that can only really come from someone having experienced this very similar kind of loss to you. If Minassian is found guilty of murder, there will be a period of time for the sentencing where victims will be able to give impact statements and talk about the impact this has had on them. Because Minassian faces so many counts of murder, there will likely be a hearing where there's a debate about how long his period of parole ineligibility will be. If he's found not criminally responsible, there is also space for victims to provide impact statements to the Ontario Review Board, but that process is a little bit different in that it's not quite like a court hearing. And so the impact statements aren't delivered in the same way and delivered with the recognition that the person is not criminally responsible. So they're somewhat different in that respect. But the process for victim participation really kicks in after a finding has been made by the judge.
Right. So that process, if it does happen, will be down the road after they sort through, again, the specifics of not criminally responsible and how culpable Minassian is. That's a question for down the road.
Exactly.
I know that this trial has been delayed a few times because of the pandemic this year. From the media side of things, do you think this trial is almost flying under the radar a little bit because of the pandemic, because it's over Zoom? I know usually with these big trials, news crews are outside of the courthouse and it's something that is reported on over weeks, but it feels different this time.
It does feel different this time. And I think, again, it comes down to there not being this kind of physical anchor point where people can go and it's not just about reporting on what happens on the day-to-day inside the courtroom, but also how people are responding to it, the mood, the opportunity to talk to people after they either give their testimony or how people are responding to testimony. There's a lot of sort of theater and drama that can happen in a court case that I don't think will come across the same way in a Zoom trial where you're sort of not hearing audible responses or collective responses to things. And yeah, the pandemic has shifted the focus of, I think, what people are thinking about and caring about. But at the same time, this trial may be more accessible than ever in some ways, right? Because even the largest courtroom in Toronto would still be likely too small to fit all the people who would want to be in that room. Those considerations have opened up to a certain extent now. The trial is not going to be broadcast. It's not going to be on TV. It's not going to be like the O.J. Simpson trial. There are really strict limitations on not videotaping the Zoom, not sharing and not screenshotting it, not making clips of it.
For all intents and purposes, it's a real court case in the same way that we can't take a picture of a courtroom. Even though it's on Zoom, we still can't take screenshots. We still can't record what's going on. You can report on it, but you can't report on what's going on. Like that element of a courtroom in and of itself, that still exists in this case.
Right. So exactly. All the same kind of restrictions that exist in court would exist in this case. And it's not a situation where anyone is going to be able to access the Zoom link. In the Theriault case, or in some other cases now we've seen, for example, a verdict being delivered over YouTube at a link that anyone could watch. And so we had, more than 20,000 people watch the Theriault decision being made. That's not going to be the case trial. It may be ultimately the case for the verdict, but it won't be the case for the trial. There's going to be restrictions on the number of people who can access the Zoom. If there are public kind of spaces in which people can watch it, there will be limitations on numbers as well. So while there will be sort of a different kind of accessibility for people, it won't be sort of a huge amount of openness or a huge change in openness. There's still going to be some physical limitations. And I think that changes a little bit the way that media report on these kinds of cases. At the same time, like the issues raised in this case around people committing mass acts of violence are really still pressing issues for our time, whether it's happening in relation to incels or white nationalists or white supremacists or any other kind of sort of terror-related situation. Like it's still really, really important to understand how to prevent these kinds of things and understand, how we can respond and prevent them from happening in the first place.
This trial begins on November 10th. Do we have any sense on how long before a decision is made?
That's a good question. There is no specified timeline for these kinds of things. We're expecting the trial to take 3 or 4 weeks. A lot of that depends on, will technology work as expected? And the pandemic makes everything a little bit more uncertain than usual. But I would expect it to be in the new year at the earliest. And it's likely that it will be a fairly detailed written sort of decision that really kind of synthesizes the evidence. This is the difference between a judge alone trial and a jury trial. Juries don't give reasons, but a judge does. I think there will be a clear explanation of how the judge comes to her decision, which takes time to prepare. So we don't know when exactly a decision will come out, but likely not this year, I would say.
Alyshah, thank you for your reporting, and we will closely follow when you start reporting on the trial starting next week.
Thanks so much.
That's Alyshah Hasham, the Toronto Star's sports and justice reporter. Alyshah will have more reporting this weekend and will track the trial every day starting November 10th. And you can follow that reporting at thestar.com. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.